Okay, well, so I'm Rosemarie Mallet. Currently, and very recently, in the last 6 months, I became the Archdeacon of Croydon, which means that I've got responsibility for the Croydon area, the priests, the Anglican priests in the Croydon area. I was telling them this morning, their themselves, their churches, their well-being, and all the stuff, the gubbins that goes on to make sure that priests can do the very best to serve the people that they've been called to serve. So that's the current job that I'm doing, which I absolutely love. I didn't think I would, because I thought it was going to be all about legals and buildings, but actually there's such a gamut of pastoral work that needs to be part to that as well. So it's great. Prior to that, I was the priest, the parish priest for Brixton, Angeltown, Brixton, which is an inner city parish, and has a very lively reputation for the challenges that people face in terms of social deprivation in the area, some of the issues around serious youth violence, gang activity, but also tremendous amount of work around community cohesion and building stronger and resilient communities. Was a lot of the work that I tried to spend my time doing while I was there. I was there 13 years, and when I was a curate, I was only about a mile away from there. So that area of Brixton and South London in general has been really much part of how I've been and who I am since the early 1990s. So in the early 1990s, I came from Barbados, where I was born originally, and then through a lot of travel to Africa, all parts of Africa, I moved back to Barbados to study first of all, but I ended up as a research fellow on social and economic research, on working on gender and issues around gender and development. And so that was, I came to Britain then to Warwick to do my PhD in sociology, and it was sociology of development. So that's what I came back from Barbados to do. And I ended up through an encounter with a friend of a friend. I ended up working at the Institute of Psychiatry on Black mental health for 13 years. And a lot of the writing that I did, that I've done really, has been in the area of trying to understand the challenges of ill health among psychological and psychiatric ill health among Black communities, particularly in the UK and particularly in South London. So my research area, I was at the Institute of Psychiatry, which is in South London, and my research area was South London, particularly Brixton and Peckham, where there's densities of Black communities. So I worked there in that area for a while, and then after training, I continued to work there, but still trying to understand the well-being of the community, primarily Black communities, but maybe trying to connect the spiritual and the social together in a way from from a work perspective. Whereas previously, I suppose I was probably doing that, but the other way around, because I was doing it from a social perspective. But because of my faith, it was always imbued with that sense of the deeper sense of trying to understand the spirituality of folk and how that held so many people together with regard to their resilience and their well-being. So, yeah. So that's a little bit of a roundabout journey to how I got to where I got to. Strangely enough, I became a priest, I think, by the oddest circumstance. I started off, anyone who knows me will know that I started off being really anti-church. So I went off to university and I went to Sussex. So if anything is going to be anti-establishment, certainly in the 70s, late 70s, 80s, and going to Sussex was probably getting your stamp on your hand to be anti-establishment. So I went off to Sussex and became extremely anti-establishment, and that meant I'm very much anti-church, because of the more I studied and I did history, the more I recognize the role of the church in underdeveloping, in working alongside capitalism to underdevelop Africa and to be a party to imperialism and slavery and all that goes with it. And also in terms of my own background in history in the Caribbean and how the church had been very much a part of the development of the systems of difference and oppression within the Caribbean for Black communities for a very long time. So I became very anti-church, but not anti-God, just not anti-faith, but just anti-church. And I then went off to live in Tanzania, which was then a socialist country, and did work in Mozambique and just a lot of work around Eastern and Southern Africa, and worked very much in development issues. And then while I was in Tanzania, however, I suppose it might have been, someone might say now, an epiphany, but I wouldn't have thought it was that at the time. But I met the most wonderful group of nuns who they're called the Maryknolls, and they are absolutely spot on social, warriors for social justice. And I hadn't really seen church people and who are warriors for social justice, who introduced me to liberation theology, who got me to understand how church could be a force for good, and how harnessing the gospel and then getting back to the gospel, getting out of the church structure and maybe sometimes doctrine, but getting back to the gospel and seeing what the gospel was calling us to do in terms of, if you think of the Magnificat, I think in terms of pulling down those with wealth and raising up the lowly and leveling the playing field, all of that, they got me to an understanding, not trying in any way to proselytize, but just through the way they lived their lives and through the things that they did, and the power of engagement with community and using the power of Jesus, the incarnational Jesus, in terms of how he lived out his life in terms of bringing grace and love and light into people's lives. That's what they did. And I kind of saw that, and I went, as I often do when when something's revealed, I could do that. I didn't want to be a nun. So that's the first thing I told them. I'm not quite interested in joining the order, so let's hold that. But the rest of it, I could do. And that switched me over to then think, okay, so the church has been this oppressive institution, and it has done all these awful things, but actually the church, as was engendered in the first century, the church that we are called to be, in my belief, our understanding of how we are to be living stones and how we are to build that church or build heaven on earth, it's about like them being warriors for social justice. It's about living out your faith, living out your love, living out that grace, and living to bind people as best as, whether that's binding them together, whether that's binding up their wounds, wherever they are, whether spiritual, whether psychological, whether social, that's, and then I got that. And then that was it. That was my big revelation. So when I left Tanzania and came back to the UK, then I went to find a church in which I could live out that call.
And now you're an Archdeacon.
And now I'm an Archdeacon. And again, I worked in psychiatry at the Institute for years and years, 13 years. And I ended up drifting ever more senior. So I kind of started off as, a junior researcher. I ended up as a research manager of a very large project, of a team of directors of a very large project. And when I felt called definitely to be in the church and to be a parish priest, I kind of went, do you know what? That's it. I've washed my hands of management and all of that stuff. But I do believe if somehow you are called towards leadership, it finds you out.
Yeah. You obviously have those leadership skills.
Yeah. But it finds you out because you kind of want to be at the charge of doing things. You want to make things happen and guide them, and it's that inner drive that you have that maybe then takes you into areas where you find yourself bringing people together or finding ways to make things happen, and that's called leadership, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And how does it sit with you now, being kind of what some people would see part of the established church?
Well, it sometimes I feel both, and so definitely I'm part of the established church without a shadow of a doubt. But you never, I feel, well, for me anyway, you never lose where you come from. So I've never lost my gaze of being on the outside looking in. So even though I'm on the inside now, and what I want to do is, I think part of what my responsibility as well as my role is always keeping that eye of being an insider outsider. So what I want to do is still the same thing, make people's lives work better. I want people to live out their faith as best as they can, and I think that my role really is to help make that happen. So I know I've seen all those those sitcoms where where they've got an archdeacon in, and the archdeacon is like the bishop's enforcer or whatever else, and I don't see it as that, since I've taken up the post. I mean, we do have a lot of legal responsibilities, and there's a lot of stuff that you do because you're a kind of middle level management basically, and you have to manage so much on behalf of people. But I think the best thing I see it as being is being the priest and looking after the well-being of the priest and their family and their congregation as best as, however the situation arises, whatever the challenges they may be facing, seeing how best I can help them manage that, and then that makes them able to get on and do the stuff that they've got to do, which is that ground level work of being Christ to the community, of sending that love and that care into the community, as well as the teaching and the leading, obviously. But it is that combination of being able to be both a teacher, a preacher, but in terms of effecting the social gospel, also going out and caring, and if possible, working on transforming their communities and the church being part of that transformative love in the community as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. Sounds like vocation to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how did you, sorry, Rosemarie.
Go ahead.
So how did you come to write the inclusive church theology in the Ethnicity book? Are you yourself, do you have a theology degree, or?
I am no theologian. I would be the first person to say, as soon as they say, oh, theology, I used to kind of probably run and hide under the desk. It took me, I think, when you've come in, well, maybe it's me, when you've come in via another trajectory. So, I was a professional sociologist, historian sociologist, and then studied theology to become a priest. But it was something I studied to become a priest. To go back out and do theology, I think, is to do that practical work of being God's agency in the community. So I always used to get worried about that word, that ology word, because it sounds like something that is something, a head thing, as opposed to a heart and an active thing. And so I just was always very nervous around it as a concept. I have to add that. But how I ended up doing that work is, one, I mean, I'm a sociologist, I'm an academic, and so I'm trying to understand how God connects into how we are as people and how our identity, how we form our identity. Well, to me would just be something that would be natural for me to want to dig deeper in and to understand. At the same time, I was on the Inclusive Church board, and part of the reason I felt that I joined and stayed there for a long time was I was very clear and very keen to ensure that when we talked about inclusive church, we really didn't silo it, and it shouldn't be seen as any kind of siloed group that only focused on the issue of sexuality, even if that was where it was formed through. As we move forward, I always say God calls us at particular times to bring movements into being, because we need to drill down on an issue where there has been significant challenge and oppression, and we need to be able to get that issue into the light. But then when we bring that issue to the light, because it's one of marginalization and differentiation and othering, it then brings forward in the capacity for us to look at the other ways in which society others groups and individuals. And so even though we were looking through that lens of the issue of sexuality or sexual identity, actually what it enabled us to do was look deeper into our understanding of what does God say about the difference. What does God say about difference, and what does God say about inclusion? And so for me, coming to that work, the area of racial identity was some work I'd been doing for years. It was part of my own kind of academic work anyway. As a sociologist, it's part of what I looked at. And so bringing that to how theology spoke into it seemed like a natural corollary to the work that I was already doing anyway.
It seems to me, when you speak, that there is a very close link anyway between sociology and religion and theology, because it's all to do with how we live and why we live the way, and what helps us live and what gives meaning to our lives and that kind of thing. So.
Absolutely. And funny enough, when I worked at the Institute of Psychiatry, when I told them that I was going to train for ministry, they couldn't understand it, because when I joined the Institute of Psychiatry, religion was seen as, one of the things that made people mad. So they could just about countenance a sociologist, because we weren't a science. So they could just about countenance having someone who was a kind of a fake scientist there, a social scientist. But really to have someone who also then believed in the God stuff seemed like, absolutely going down. So there was another person who was very a person of faith there. But in general, part of what I was called to do sometimes was try to explain the way in which religion underpinned the lives of Caribbean people specifically, and how that might not be a manifestation of ill health, but actually might be part of the resilient structure for folk, as opposed to something that was bringing them even more into a difficult mental health situation. So it was interesting that when I said I feel really called to be to ministry, I remember my professor said, well, I'll write you a reference, but I don't really want you to go down that avenue.
Interesting. Yes. Yeah, well, it's hard, it's difficult, isn't it? If you're coming from a certain angle at things, it is very difficult to understand, I think.
Yeah. And I think because, you think of, I've certainly know that's a particular professor, when people were still thinking of, that whole issue of whether religion was the opiate of the people, and therefore being used to dumb people down or to keep the working classes, in their place, etc., etc. If that was the kind of mindset that was underpinning how you thought about religion, and then if you also felt that that religion was something personal or actually not real, so it's some kind of made-up system or structure of belief that just keeps people thinking that the world will be better in the future, and so therefore they don't have to attend to too much to what is happening now. If you start to kind of believe all those tropes, then it does, for some people make them feel that really and truly you don't want people to have a kind of religious ideology, because then that might make them not deal with the reality of their situation. And so, as a lot of working with people with mental health challenges, it's about ensuring they have insight. For some people, religion took away some of that insight if they went, well, I'll leave it up to God, as opposed to taking some personal responsibility for enabling themselves to understand their situation and work up ways to help themselves get better, to have some.
And of course, that is a danger sometimes in some religion.
Yeah, and that was the challenge. So it was about trying to find, so to listen to people and to understand if actually, because it can happen, that people had kind of got onto that kind of trigger, and that had kind of tipped them over the edge, where their faith had kind of taken them down a really dark place, in terms of trying to not help them be the best that they could be at times. So I certainly saw it, but I was also there to argue that we can't just assume that it's a negative just because somebody says they're of faith.
Yeah, and actually it can also be a route to flourishing for people.
Absolutely. And what's interesting now, so this is all kind of, it welds together quite well, because at the beginning, as I said, there was this suspiciousness of religion, and then towards the end of the time I was leaving, and not just because of me, there was a desire to work with churches, because what was recognized is that, well, if you were working in the area I worked in, which is ethnicity and mental health, a lot of folk were connected to a faith community of one sort or the other, whether it would be Christian or Muslim or Hindu or whatever, but a lot of people of color were connected to faith communities, particularly the first generation, if not second generation, of the children born of people who migrated here. So you needed to really have an understanding of faith as it lived, as they lived it out, to be really able to understand how to help them and how to connect with them. So that became much more important and much more understood, that you had to look at the context of people's lives, and faith was a major part of the context of their lives. So that became, as I say, really very important. And why I think it's a real connector now is that I'm now on a committee working back with the Institute of Psychiatry, well, the Maudsley Hospital, looking at the pandemic and the way in which that could more negatively impact on the mental ill health of people of colour, particularly, but all communities, but people of colour, and how faith and faith groups can play a part in supporting people's mental well-being.
Yeah. And it can be a great motivator as well. That's what, it can be, some religion can be, like you say, it takes away agency. It doesn't do good in the now, because people are told that it doesn't matter, the now, and it only. But on the other hand, it can be a great motivator for good, because I did some work with Citizens UK in Mansfield when I lived there, and they know, even though most of their organisers are atheists, they know that the way to work is to work with all these institutions, most of whom are religious institutions.
Absolutely. I'm a member of Citizens and have been for years, and the thing that has always connected me with Citizens is the fact that they bring civil society and faith communities together on an equal playing field. And so that means everybody has a right at the table, and whether you're a trade union or whether you're a church, the reason you're there is for social good and to bring better outcomes for communities. And that's always been the driver in my life anyway. So it's great to work with an institution that has that flat structure of trying to connect communities and organisations together.
Yeah, that's really good. That's interesting that you've also been involved with Citizens.
Yeah,
it's been a good thing. I was going to pick up on something you said before we move on to another question on the list. That you were talking about your work in Black communities and mental health, and there for me that's very inclusive church, because it's that intersectionality, isn't it? Of, you know, I often say when I'm speaking to churches that intersectionality is not only about thinking that actually all exclusion is the same exclusion, etc., and that we should be in solidarity with different people who are excluded, but also that you have often multiple exclusions. You know, like I could say I'm lesbian and I'm a woman. You know, you could say you're a woman and you're Black. You know, and the mental health often is badly affected by exclusion. So often you get, probably, I don't know about your research, but certainly I know that LGBT people are more likely to have mental health problems. Maybe it's the same in the Black community.
Certainly. So I worked in the sharp end in terms of psychoses. And so at that point, in terms of our research, standard across the world, people are wanting 4 times to be depressed. That's a standard ratio, everybody knows. In terms of schizophrenia, what you would find is that Black people in this country were 16 times more likely to be diagnosed with psychotic illness as a white counterpart of a similar age. And so part of the work was trying to understand why, and then trying to look at the social determinants of that. And so absolutely, and as you rightly say, they layer up, you know, whether it's, we call it intersectionality or whatever it is. I always say things are like a shellac, you know, you just get more and more layers of challenging situations, and it's how you kind of work your way through that. So yes, mental health, ethnicity, gender, and then they could weave together. So sometimes some of the work we did was around you know, young girls with poor mental health, and challenges around their identity, and just so many ways that othering or difference connects together, and then just means that people just don't have that option of choice of how they connect into society, that capacity to have agency or to understand that they've got any power over their lives, and to be able to find ways to be better than perhaps, you know, the current circumstances are, because they can't see the way out. And it is these, as you know, intersectional challenges that do kind of stop them, because that box or that silo just feels like it's very oppressive. So gender, sexuality, I mean, all the isms as we know them, but when they kind of work together, and of course, you know, Black women are different to white women. And one of the things I started work on gender, I'm so back in the day now, but I was working at the Institute of Psychiatry in the late 80s on issues of gender identity with Kate Young. That the word had just been about coined at that time, and people didn't even really understand, because it was women in development or gender in development, and people didn't even understand what those terminologies meant. But it was this trying to understand how that differs. And so at the same time, there would be Black women, you know, one of my heroes, Angela Davis, who would be, you know, shouting out, but it's different for us.
Yeah.
It's different for us, you know. Spare Rib had a whole set of articles around womanism, because while white feminists, particularly middle-class white feminists, would have an understanding of how they would want the world to look, that didn't look the same way for Black women who were doubly oppressed anyway, not just by toxic masculinity, but how that oppression of ethnicity worked within the society, and then within that toxic quote-unquote masculinity, how that masculinity worked within their own cultures as well. And so you had to find different ways of understanding contextually the lives of different people. And I suppose it's always been that kind of understanding of the way these things interweave, and how identity isn't something that you can just pull a string and say, well, I am this, or she is that, or he is, because we're all, you know, products of the cultures and the context that we were born into or raised into, and how that then shapes us to have those, we now call them unconscious biases or conscious biases. We use those words, but how that cultural context layers into our understanding of the world and the people around us.
Mm-hmm. And you use this word shellac. What is that? What is that word? I don't think I've heard that word before.
Oh, shellac is like a veneer. Maybe it's an American word. I spent a lot of time with the American.
How do you spell that? With an S-H?
Shellac.
Okay, I'll have to look it
So
up.
I think in English it might be veneer, but
Yeah.
it's like when you're polishing wood and you put another layer on and another layer on, and after a while it's like a turtle. I think it's their shells are made up of layers and layers and layers and layers and layers, of the skin as they grow. So that's the way for me sometimes our identities are like that. They're kind of layered up upon us, and depending on where we are in life, it's which particular identity is the one that people will focus in on. I mean, I lived in one particular place where, although it was in Africa, and although I was of the same shade as the majority of folk that lived there, I was still othered because I wasn't of that place. And because my history, my forebears' history was one of slavery, that was actually used as part of the othering, in terms of my identity of not being a completely free and emancipated person, because I'd come through a historical structure of having enslavement as part of my my background, and that was something that was said.
Really? So it was said out loud. It wasn't just an undercurrent.
It was said, and so and so I say to folk, I've lived in so many different cultures and societies that living in the United Kingdom as a Black person, as a Black woman, you have all the challenges of colour and gender, but that doesn't mean when you go to another country where you may look the same as many of the folk that live there, that there won't be ways in which you might find yourself othered also. And because people have this utopia, they think, well, I don't know, if I go to somewhere that everybody looks like me, then it's going to be marvelous, and life will just be perfectly wonderful, and it doesn't work like that.
You're reminding me of a program we were watching, actually. It was in this. There's a series on, I think it's on BBC iPlayer, about Black history and Black geography and things. Is it Afua Hirsch, I think?
Maybe Afua.
Who was visiting Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Did you see it?
I lived there for a year.
Oh, did you? And there were people there that had come to live there from America, Canada, and places. And basically they'd kind of got to the stage where they were accepted, I think, in the first place, but now they're kind of a bit rejected and isolated by the community there, which is just really
it was interesting. I think one of the things I found, and this is one completely different question to ask, but one of the things I found, so where I feel most at home is actually in my birth home, which is Barbados. That's where I feel most at home, and that's where the analogy that somebody reminded me of the other day, which I do use, it's I feel like in general I have to walk around with a raincoat. This is England, so English people carry an umbrella, quote unquote, because it's always the potential for rain. There's always the potential for a racist act to happen in your life, and so I say I walk around with a raincoat, and it's on most of the time, because when I go out the door I just never know what could happen. And even sometimes in the most supposedly sunny climes, you could just have something awful happen, whether consciously or unconsciously. So, and the only place where I ever feel that I can actually take off that particular raincoat and just feel completely at home and able to just be me is actually when I get into Barbados and the door opens of the plane and I just go, yeah, this is home, this is me.
Yeah.
And so for many people, they may have that place. It could be somewhere in the country, it could be somewhere where they grow. You know, people have that space where they know, just instinctively know themselves to be at ease, peace. But I never feel that living in this country. It isn't that I kind of live constantly, you know, on the alert, looking around for stuff, but I just do know that the hairs at the back of your neck, that that life just can't be lived without that little frisson of expectation of something could just happen because you are Black and because you're a woman. And the two things combining and can for some people be too totally unexpected, and for some, even if they don't verbalize it, still unacceptable, you know. So you could be in a position, I remember when I was going to do a funeral once, it was hilarious. I was going off to do this funeral. It was my first funeral without my vicar anywhere near in tow. And I turned up at the block of flats. And the first thing that alerted me to the fact that I might be different to the folk inside the door, because I didn't know, was that there was a very loud dog barking. And this is an old Caribbean trope that often, you know, a lot of older Caribbean families wouldn't have dogs inside the house. So I thought, oh gosh, it's a large dog. That probably means that they might be white in this household. So then I kind of, because I was quite a new priest, so I kind of then said, okay, deep breathe, because they might open the door and say, we don't want a Black priest. I mean, it had happened to colleagues. So I said, okay, deep breathe, hold yourself in line. I'm scared of the dog anyway. It's the first thing. I don't know what I'm going to find behind the door in terms of this visit. And I don't know if they're suddenly going to go, oh my gosh, you're not the white priest who we know, that the vicar at the church. And of course they opened the door, and yes, there was a large dog, but they were the most wonderful, garrulous, engaged family that I've had the pleasure of helping them go through that journey of loss, bereavement, and the funeral journey with them. So you kind of gear yourself up though, because you just don't know.
But you can't. It can't be helped. It's just because you've got a lifetime of experiences, you know, and that's it's almost like it's a pleasant relief when it doesn't happen.
Absolutely. And I think, I suppose, within this context, talking about the church and ethnicity and identity, it's that people often say to me, oh my gosh, I didn't think there would be, so that this is often a joke, racism in the church. I didn't think there would be sexism in the church. I mean, I even had a conversation with someone today, and they were shocked to understand the arc of the Anglican Church going from conservative evangelical churches where women's leadership is not accepted to conservative Catholic churches. They would say traditional Catholic churches where women's leadership is still not accepted. And they were just shocked that was a reality, because they said, well, it's a church. How could that be a possibility, never mind a reality? And so, people often say to me, well, this is the church and that can't happen. And I think I naively stumbled into church off the pews, into aspects of leadership, whether it be training for ordination or becoming a curate or otherwise, and slowly having those scales drop off my eyes, and also be like other folk and think, oh my gosh, I didn't, I'm reading the scriptures, I didn't think that this was going to be very much part of the structural, institutional reality of the church also. So that's been an eye-opener, and has also then provided me with part of being who I am and the work that I do. So to try to become part of that difference, or bringing that difference, or making that change, or enabling others to come into. I think recently I was reading, as many people are, as Zaria Williams's book, Franz Williams's book, and he, you know, he talks about the different ways in which people can enable or disable, and I think it's, for me, it's part of understanding how we can enable or be a bridge to encourage people to be part of the leadership and management of the church, but also not be blinded to the difficulties of that still exist in taking on those roles and those responsibilities. So
open. Yeah.
So I think lots of ways to where I am now. Theologians that inspired me. Gosh,
I think ask yourself your own questions now.
Yeah. Well, I was just starting to think, because you asked me about theology earlier and how I came into theology.
Please do go for it. I think you've answered the third one, actually, about your experience of being Black in British society. I think that's pretty much answered.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go for it. The theologians that inspire you, brilliant.
Well, I think because I said I came via sociology, and I came, you know, via almost, I don't know, what's the word, literature, and, you know, my understanding of who I am and how I am came via people like Langston Hughes and Maya Angelou and Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, I kind of built up a capacity to understand my own identity first and foremostly, before I came to understand my identity in Christ, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I had a faith, but my faith used to probably be on a shelf, you know, something I kept to myself, and didn't really see it as part of the whole of me. So I was Black and I was a Christian of faith, but the two of them didn't slide together because they would seem like two different silos. You know, person of faith, being very faithful to Christ, following Christ's way, but that didn't connect to this Black person. So I think that helped when I started training, and I came across people like Bonhoeffer in terms of discipleship, and I came across, you know, Miroslav Volf in terms of looking at identity and the embrace. And that started to help me put those together and start to think, okay, actually, they're not separate boxes. It's all one box. It's all works together. So I think that was really powerful for me. And then people like somebody later on, people like Anthony Reddy, people like Robert Beckford started to pull at that much more deeper understanding of James Cone, trying to then really understand the role that being Black or people of color have, actually not just as an aspect of being church, but actually one of the central aspects of being church. You know, so if Christ exists or came into being to enable us to look beyond ourselves and love the other, by being the very much othered, actually Christ came into being to enable people to understand the center, which are the people who you other. And so therefore I started to kind of really more connect an understanding of who I am and how that is brought up not just in my own identity, but in that Christian identity and that Christian understanding of what that exceptional and scandalous love is. And that exceptional scandalous love is drawing all those groupings of people that we've often pushed to the margins, and not in so many way to go out and do mission to those groups, but actually in recognition that that's the core, that's the heart, that's the heartbeat. And that rebalancing was really helpful for me in being able to situate myself as a, you know, as a person of faith, and as somebody then who could try to live out that faith in a proactive and, you know, in a kind of way of pulling praxis together of understanding the theology and then working out practically how to live that out. in the world. So yeah, so folk like that were really, really keen to me. But then, you know, I think of Phyllis Tribble, and some of her work was again really, really helpful in trying to help me anchor myself in terms of theology. There's a book by a woman called Hazel Carby, which is in terms of gender identity, which is called White Woman Listen. And it was that business of actually, you who think you're mainstream, stop and listen to the beat of those others that you have called other previously. So I think, yeah, work like that has been really engaging and uplifting, and also embedding for me, of helping me be what I am. I've got a book here. I love it. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's by Zora Neale Hurston.
I've not heard of it.
I love myself. I just love it. I love myself when I'm laughing, and then again when I'm looking mean and impressive. And I love it as a title. She's an amazing author, but you know, back in the 1930s, I mean, she was writing some of the most powerful literature around ethnicity and identity, and as a woman as well. So just powerful things to help center and help you give you a sense of self. And of course, as I said, you know, Angela Davis came along and did that work in the 70s. Audre Lorde was there as well, James Baldwin. I mean, so I'll get her all over the place, but I just recently rewatched that James Baldwin, I Am Not Your Nigger, and just such a powerful film. Just speaking out, I think, everything that a Black person would want someone to hear about who we are, and I think in the end, I think he says it, and in every time I speak, we all say the same thing. He says, I just want to be able to, you know, get up and walk down the road and have peace in my life. I just want what you want. I don't want any more. I just want the same. And so that, I think, when you hear or read people who can articulate how you feel about who you are and what you would want for your life and everybody else's life, and I think wherever perspective you come from, and that is connected into our faith, you just want a world where people can feel that they are free to be who they are, and it pours out powerfully often from the mouths of the marginalized. So whether they are people of faith, or whether they, you know, eschew faith because they felt that faith has let them down, or it's gone down a road where it's, you know, driven them into a buffer and stopped. You know, so I think that the big arguments between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, you know, as to whether, you know, that faith had sidelined people into more passive reactionism, you know, by non-violence, passivity, or whether we had to, you know, go down a route where we kind of stood up for ourselves, and you've still got those debates going on, and both of those people were powerful people of faith, but taking their faith onto the streets in different ways. So again, I think when I was 13, I discovered Martin Luther King and Angela Davis at the same time. So again, if I think you asked me earlier about some of the things that drive me, yeah, about the age of 13, discovering, Martin Luther King's work, and then also discovering the Black Panthers and Angela Davis, and trying to find a way to merge those two into my life.
I suspect the one thing they do have in common, because I've been involved quite a bit with some peace work, like Christian peacemaker teams and that in my life, and I suspect the one thing that they would have in common, both of those sides, is that neither is actually passive in terms of not doing anything, or
absolutely,
you know what I mean, not taking action or actually getting into the face.
Absolutely.
No, it was pacifist.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King.
Yeah. That, and I think people make that mistake Because Martin Luther King said he never asked people to just sit down and do nothing.
Take it, yeah.
You know, what he asked them to do was get out there and protest. But the way in which you respond is the difference. But that doesn't stop you from letting people know. So, you know, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, started 4 years ago as one lone man, making his stand very powerfully. And, you know, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, we had the whole of the NBA, all of the NFL, the whole swathe of tennis in the United States, all stop. 4 years ago, he was by himself. He took this stand and, you know, ostracized by some or many. And 4 years later, by faith, or, you know, by dint of just continuing, not violently, but actually taking an action that says, enough is enough. This is too much. And if it's only me saying it, I'm just going to say it. And I think that's the difference, isn't it? It's that's where that stands. But you've got to say it, and that's what they would all say. It isn't about not standing up and saying, this is enough. It's then what actions you take beyond that, you know. So
it was like a forebearer of the kind of this recent. I know Black Lives Matter has been has been going on for longer than this like year, but
8 years now.
Yeah, so that's it. So he's not a forebearer in that way, but what is it? Colin Kaepernick.
Yeah, Colin Kaepernick.
What he did, he got so shunned for it, and he didn't it destroy his career and everything. And now you've got the whole of the almost entirely white English cricket team.
Absolutely.
In every match I've watched.
Absolutely.
Now it's suddenly, it's like something's shifted, but you see he's a prophet and people like that.
Absolutely. John the Baptist.
Parks, who first refused to move on the bus, you know, that's like a prophet, that person.
Yeah,
you know, they do
absolutely. And someone's got to be there. Someone's got to be the one that kind of picks up the one rock and says, you know, I'm going to pull it out. And if it all falls down, it falls down. If it falls on me, it falls on me. But I'm just going to pull it out because someone's got to say that should be there. That shouldn't happen. And I think, you know, going back to my theology, for me, that's the person of Jesus Christ. I mean, you know, as John the Baptist says, I am not the one. That's the person of Jesus Christ who comes into a situation and says, this isn't the way of love. This isn't the way of grace. It isn't that laws are wrong, but we're using them in the wrong way. We're not using them in ways that include, that encourage, that engage, that build up. We're using them in ways that separate. And that's not how it's to be. And I think so he was obviously he was a prophet, and I think in Islam he's seen as a prophet, but he was also the kind of, we would say, the end of that line of that prophetic voice, because he is the final prophetic voice that comes to tell us, and then other people now come to interpret it. So the disciples and Paul, they're interpreters of his, you know, his prophetic message to us. The rest of it has been the interpreters of the message to us. And then we can go different ways in terms of how they tell us to interpret it. But he is the one that came to say, this is not, he is that suffering servant. That's the metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah.
And people who pick up on that, you know, Colin Kaepernick, Rosa Parks, that's what they become. They become that, the suffering servant, as in Isaiah. They become the ones that...
History repeats, doesn't it? You know, you keep looking back to Jesus and how Jesus stood up to all these things that were wrong and up to authorities and would put himself in danger. And that's exactly what people continue to do.
Exactly. So even if you can't see theology in it, for those of us who are of faith, we see that precursor. We see Christ's love, Christ on the cross, as lived out as suffering and living to give us that example of how it is to offer yourself. Is it? I think the reading for Sunday is pick up your cross and follow me. And that's the metaphor. Because, you know, as I say, whether these people are of faith or no faith or of a different faith, it's that same message. It's about, you know, well, as a Christian, I would say it's about picking up the cross. And picking up the cross means taking up the concerns, taking up the things that you see in life that are not right and that need to be changed or transformed. Pick up that cross and follow the Christ who leads us into transformation. That's what that metaphor means. That's what it holds for us. And so people like me who have come through of the diaspora, whose, you know, forebears have come through the Middle Passage waters, for whom slavery is part of their heritage, it still isn't something that I would then say, so I don't follow Christ. I would say that is also part of the cross I've got to pick up and follow the liberator, because Christ didn't come as an oppressor, he came as a liberator. And so I have to pick up part of that cross, which is about the kind of continued oppressive mentality of racism, which continues on post-slavery into our world. That's what I want to see transformed. So that's the cross that I also pick up and take along as I follow him to transformation and hope for liberation.
And you know, moving on from that, talking about kind of these prophets and these people and how things have suddenly shifted, we could move on to this question about the Black Lives Matter movement, which is, what do you hope for from the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of long and short-term successes going forward?
Well, I think, and everyone says this, you know, I've been on panels where people are saying it, you know, we are just, are we seeing a tectonic plate shift in the world? You know, we've had different points in time, and for America, it's obviously the civil rights movement, that's the biggest one. In Britain, we've had different points, maybe around the Macpherson report, where it looked as if society was going to start to actually shift into a more equitable understanding of people and an understanding of ethnicity and identity as all being similar and all being of similar worth. But it just got stuck in a groove after a point. It got ossified into legalese. It got ossified into a system, and then it got taken up with proportionality and, you know, and I think what we want now, and of course at the same time it was always still them and other. It was still always people of color, Black people, pleading to be allowed into the room, to be allowed around the table, to be given some form of acceptance and you know, to build their capacity to be built, to be, you know, equal to or equitable to. And at the moment, I think what this Black Lives Matter says is not only the Black Lives Matter, because of course they matter, but actually we don't need to be given the key to come into the door of the club room, because we are equal to already. So we don't need you to give us extra points on, I don't know, extra brownie points to say, good, you know, now you can come in, or you can come, or you can't come. And I think the reason why I think the shift has been is because more and more and more people from different backgrounds across the world have recognized that this Black Lives Matter campaign is important, not just in America. It's important not just because it's something to do with justice and social justice or racial justice. It's important not just because it's to do with social inequality between people majority Black, call it that, and people majority white. Actually, it is important because of the isms and the schisms in all our society. So I've heard people in India now talking again about the caste system and the way in which colorism also binds people in that community.
They have a different type of black, don't they? That's the truth.
You know, I've seen people in European countries talk about the ways in which other groups are also differentiated because of darkness of hue, if you want to call it that, because of color of skin being different. So actually, I think people have started to look at this and not just see it as a an issue of people of African heritage, but actually have started to see the bigger picture, that this Black Lives Matter campaign isn't just about all lives matter, so to kind of amorphisize it and say this isn't something that's acute that we've got to turn our attention to. But actually, like I said at the beginning, by turning our attention to this issue, we are also turning the screw on an understanding of how society actually works to make some people definitely more unequal than others. And whether that's going to be, the issues that we've had obviously over the years around gender inequality in our institutions, the BBC or otherwise, this is something that now can be spoken about. And I don't think it can be put back in the bottle in the same way. So when you've got someone as powerful as now powerful as David Olusegun, coming up and saying exactly what I'm saying, that you may think by looking at me that I'm this amazing Black historian doing this fantastic work on the BBC, and I may look suave and I may look like I'm in control and I'm really confident, but actually the reality is I've had to deal with so much rubbish in my life, and I've just had to get on top of it and deal with it to just become who I am. But I've still that's the shellac. I've got all those layers of stuff that's happened to me, despite what you're saying. Actually, what I am is all of this. And I think since he said that in the lecture last week, there's been a number of people, which we know from before, coming out from the BBC saying, yeah, they've struggled and suffered in the same way. So I don't think, that's why I'm saying this genie can't be put back in the bottle. So I think long term, I would hope that it does something about embedding in our minds as well as in our structures a better understanding about what it really means to be an equitable society, and what it really means as Christians to see the image of Christ in the other, whoever the other is, what it really means to recognize yourself in the other, and to know that you are very much, your diversity and your difference is your glory. That's the way I see it. Otherwise, we'd all look like Stepford wives, or behave like Stepford wives, or we'd all be that dreaded robots that seems to be coming towards us in some form of AI. And we're not that. The beauty of humanity is the difference of humanity. That's what's amazing about us, that we are different. We look different, we think different, we move different. That's our beauty, that's our joy, that's to celebrate. But underneath that, then we live and move and have our being. We bleed the same. We love the same. Our emotions are similar. And we need to kind of recognize that and see that in the other, and not see it as a way to differentiate ourselves from another person because they happen to look different or love different or walk different or, dance different. We need to kind of just know that the beauty is the differentiation, because that's what just gives us that wonderful shape. But
it's about holding them both, isn't it? Both are true. Both these are true,
Absolutely. But they're the essential of humanity. They, to me, are what makes us who we are. And I've always said for years, and I don't think that makes me a theologian, but whenever people talked about the original sin, and the original sin obviously is Eve and the terrible thing she did by going along and listening to the serpent and blah, 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 blah. I said the original sin isn't any of that. The original sin is the way in which we learn to differentiate and other. Because in the garden, at that point, all was the same. All was equitable. Yes, I made them male and female, but they weren't clothed in any way. I just made them different, so they had different attributes, but they were joyously different, and they loved who they were for who they were.
And some people say the translation is closer to he made them, or God made them from male to female, which is
from male to female, or as I would say, everything in the end comes from female. Male comes from female. So we are birthed through the waters of the womb of a female. Jesus was born of woman and became a man, and that means that from the very beginning, God meant that men and women, however they are defined, however we do gender, but sexuality, men and women were like this. So this othering came about, and I think the story for me, if one wants to think of what is that story about, it's about trying to get to understand why we differentiate, why we separate ourselves.
All babies start off as female, don't they? I think. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Why do we? And I think the whole story, that whole story in the garden, is about helping people get to grips with an understanding of differentiation and othering, because that's at the core of that story. To me, it's because at the end of the day, before they get tossed out, they are told that, you know, man will be like this, and woman will be like this, and animal will be like this, and suddenly you get attributes.
The disconnect, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a disconnect, and that's what I think is that to me is the sin.
And between nature and humans.
Yeah, that's it, and that's the sin. That's what comes in. To me, that's what comes in. So, you know, when people want to, you know, some people want to write that as, you know, sinfulness of women or whatever. I just think that what comes in is the way in which we have learned to differentiate and other ourselves from each other as humanity, and as you've said, from creation. So we other ourselves from creation, and that we've not really come back to finding the ways to pull that together well, and that's why we are, I feel, where we are, and that's kind of how I view things theologically in terms of my understanding of why we spend a lot of time fighting.
Yeah, I think, you know, that it sounds like your theology is very similar to my theology. I definitely think that, that if there is an original sin, it's definitely this kind of disconnect between people, between us and God, between us and nature, and all of that.
Absolutely. But, you know, I mean, some people, for some people, this will be their fundamental theological understanding of the world, in terms of gendered identities, etc. And for some of us, this story will be a metaphor to help us understand the way we live our lives, and then as we go through the Bible, as we go from Genesis, and then we go through to Revelation, what's revealed to us is the way we should come back together and heal that disconnect and find ways to be bound together with creation and with each other, but loving each other in all our glorious diversity.
Yes.
Before the throne of God. And
that's the differentiation only in terms of loving the diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Celebrating it. But because we have to have it. You know, we have to have it. So that's how I see that kind of Genesis to Revelation story. It's trying to enable us to be both and better than, and so is that my pop theology?
Definitely, yes, you've definitely got theology going down there. Yeah. Given us a lot to think about. I'm just going to ask a very, very finally, because I don't want to keep you too much longer, but it's been really, really interesting, really great to chat with you. I just wonder, these two last questions are kind of linked, really, just about things you might recommend. So your own writing. I know you've obviously written in the Ethnicity book, which we definitely recommend everyone reads.
Absolutely.
But if you've written anything else, I mean, some work maybe on
I think most of
backgrounds in mental health and
yeah, most of my work, and I would say most of my work is around Black lives and mental health. And if you're interested in it, it's still pertinent. So just Google it, Google me, and you'll see that there's work around culture identity and mental well-being. So that's the kind of area that I spent a lot of time working in for many years, and I think it's still pertinent. In terms of other things, I've mentioned James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain, The Fire Next Time. I've mentioned Audre Lorde, I've mentioned Angela Davis. I mean, all the great people that I absolutely adore, they're there. And I suppose if I'm going to end, there's just too much. If I could just, well, you can see the books behind me, and that's just a lot behind me, not the ones over there. I started in life not even thinking I'd be an academic or anything else. I thought I'd be a historian, but I started off in life, as I said, reading probably Angela Davis and Martin Luther King were the things that started me off probably on this route, and they still hold me. But like many people, the one woman that just speaks to me, well, two women speak to me because of their experience. I'm going to say three women that speak to me because of their experience, who I absolutely love. So one is Joan Armatrading.
Oh, I love Joan Armatrading. My parents had records of her, and I used to play them when I was younger.
So I just think, in terms of understanding, again, someone who just kind of connects into identity and just helps to convey that to others. I think she certainly brought me through so much of who I am. The other person is Nina Simone. So you
also love, yeah.
Just because of that power that she had of being able to speak into a movement, not just a moment, but a movement, and to imbue it with just dignity, and all doing that with bipolar, undiagnosed bipolar, is complete. And so all the challenges she faced were around that particular issue in her life. So just phenomenal. And then I just think the final one has got to be Maya Angelou. And so they may not be people, they may be people you know and you love, but I think in terms of thinking about a conversation with me and people I know and I love, and people who help me to be who I am, then I think those three people and their works absolutely are smack center of me being able to get up in the morning and still love God and love the world.
Wonderful. It's almost like you've given us a little mini Desert Island Discs and books. I love it. No, those people are three brilliant women, brilliant Black women. Oh.
Brilliant Black women from different parts of the world. Yeah. I don't know. Because I'm of a particular age. I mean, now I've got Afro Hirsch's stuff behind me. I've got is it Bernardina Evaristo to read, because I want to read her work. I'm finishing up Ghost Ship. So if I haven't mentioned it, I know I said it earlier, but obviously Ghost Ship is our latest iteration of understanding race and the church.
Azariah Franz Williams.
Azariah Franz Williams' book is absolutely spot on in terms of understanding that. But I think you can't go wrong if you look up Anthony Reddy's work. You can't go wrong, because you've got a powerful Black theologian there who is also a conscious Black theologian as well. So he kind of gets that understanding of gender as well as of ethnicity.
The big picture. He gets the big picture.
Big picture. Yeah. So.
Well, he was our first Black theologian to have on this series, so it's nice to end with a mention for him as well.
Yeah, no, he's and I think again he's one of those people that just with Anthony, he maybe David did, I don't know, but he kind of worked away doing his stuff when it wasn't fashionable. When people weren't listening, You know, so as we talked about prophets earlier, and he was pulling out this work and doing it. And other people were doing some similar work, but they got television programs and they got, you know, airtime, and Anthony didn't. And I think because he was seen as perhaps a bit too radical, a bit too cutting edge. I mean, you know, pulling too much stuff out there. And now I just think he's certainly not the centre. He's still on. He's still writing from the margins, if you know what I mean. But kind of tossing those bombs into the centre, and I just think it's wonderful stuff. Yeah,
brilliant. I know, I've read a bit for my course, so yeah, definitely recommended.
Yeah.
I have somebody knocking at the door, so that's going to end to this conversation. But it's really, really lovely to chat to you, Rosemarie. Thank you so much.
It's been a joy. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye bye.